Hello, everyone, and welcome to the OUP webinar series. My name is Mark Singer, and I'm a managing partner here at Osage University Partners in charge of our tech investment practice. Today, we're having a conversation on recruiting talent for university startups. The goal of the webinar is twofold. First, we want to share best practices from 3 geographically dispersed talent sourcing programs, whose core concept is to attract talented, experienced, business-minded entrepreneurs to promising university startup opportunities. Our second goal is to provide general advice for universities that are struggling to identify and recruit experienced executives to take their startups to the next level. This entire topic is highly relevant for us here at OUP. When you're in the venture capital business, you're fundamentally in the business of backing people. So we're constantly searching for great talent for startups in which we're already an investor or are looking to invest. And we're also continuously evaluating the talent that we have in our pipeline, trying to determine who would make the next best CEO or CSO or VP of product. So we can say from our experience that there are no magic bullets to finding and attracting top talent to university startups, but there are paths that can lead to a more successful outcome. We look forward to exploring those paths with you today. To get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Hamdi Çavuşoğlu, who is the Director of Partnerships at the Innovation Accelerator Foundation and the Director of the Academic Venture Exchange. Welcome, Hamdi.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Great. Second, we have Mike Sarathakis, who leads the Tech Transfer Venture Center at the University of Michigan. Please say hello, Mike.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And lastly, we have Hazel Muher, who's the head of talent at Oxford Sciences Innovation, an investment firm dedicated to Oxford University spinouts. Welcome, Hazel.
Hello from very rainy Oxford.
For our audience, in just a moment, you'll notice a poll appearing on your screen. If you could please fill this out, we'd love to know how many people are attending this webinar today with you. Thank you. For the first part of the webinar, our panelists will each take a few minutes to present information about their programs and talent sourcing efforts. The second part of the webinar will be structured as questions and answers. We're hopeful to receive lots of questions from you, and we have a good history in our webinars of receiving lots of questions. So if you'd like to submit a question, including right now, please use the Q&A feature on your toolbar, which is likely either at the top or the bottom of your screen. So we're going to start off now by having our speakers introduce themselves and provide backgrounds on their programs. Hamdi, it would be great if you could start us off.
Wonderful. It's a pleasure to meet you all digitally. So once again, my name is Hamdi, and I am the Director of the Academic Venture Exchange. And the first question I always get is, what is AVX? So to summarize quickly on the next slide, we were formed as an initiative of a slightly bigger foundation called the Innovation Accelerator Foundation, and we're structured as a nonprofit cooperative exchange of leading US universities. And we started in 2016 to kind of start solving this interesting problem that was developing, that a lot more universities were seeing benefit from startup licenses than traditional licenses. A lot of this happens due to large corporations preferring to enter joint ventures, strategic partnerships, and eventually M&A of many of these startups, that a lot of the success of these startup licenses end up occurring. However, there's a big challenge for this that we're starting to call the talent valley of death. Ultimately, there's a challenge of a mismatch. If you have a great pharmaceutical invention, you can't really match it with an entrepreneur with experience in cybersecurity or advanced materials. It's just not the right sort of skill set, not the right sort of business environment. Second of all, there's a problem of a bottleneck. There's not enough fundable entrepreneurs or opportunities at any one location to create a critical mass outside of, say, Cambridge and New York and San Francisco. But even there's still challenges of priority, where it's actually the ownership of team building and matchmaking is neglected when other fires need to be put out at your offices. So ultimately, we're focused on pooling innovation assets of startups, entrepreneurs, and investors into a network. So next slide, please. So we started out from this wide pool of partner institutions. The top row were our starting pool of institutions in 2016. And then since then, for the past 6-8 months, we've continued to grow, and we hope to expand to more. So I'd like to show you a little bit as to what AVX's process looks like at kind of an observational level. So next slide, please. So you can imagine kind of a network where we have technology solicited from our partner institutions on the top row and members referred to us at the bottom. And we generate at first directed suggestions. So we look at information based on these people and we send out directed email marketing and contacts saying, hey, we think you would be great for this opportunity for these reasons based on your background. And remember, a lot of these referrals of talent are referred to us as entrepreneurs, executives, mentors, and residences at Stanford, at UChicago, at WashU St. Louis, at Columbia, at Harvard, at MIT. So these are people that have already been pre-vetted, but continue to be vetted through this process. Because after we send these introductions, our next step is, moving one step forward, we listen and we try to hear back acknowledgments of, yes, we want to meet these teams. So these people sometimes being directly reached out to say, yes, I want to speak to this team. Or other times they reach into our database and be like, you know, this team is interesting, but also this other team looks interesting to me. So we end up tracking these relationships. We end up providing introductions to offices. And as time goes on, so next animation, some of these connections effectively die off. The conversations don't lead anywhere, or it was very friendly for the first 2 times, but the team's too early, or the expectations are different on both sides, or we end up evaluating that the technology is not quite right or the person's not quite right. So some of these quickly die off, and then some other ones, next step, slowly die off as well. And eventually we end up getting strong matches between teams of entrepreneurial champions and technologies looking to cross this next valley of death. So with that, we are up to 15 different teams formed. Next slide. With about 18 different talent partners. So each pairing of each cube, the top row is the academic inventor and the bottom row is an entrepreneur and an investor. And we have about 51 potential matches on our way forward. I would say of that 51, based on our statistics, maybe 10 to 15 of those work out in the next 6 months. So we have quite a warm pipeline coming down. And I would like to talk about 2 examples a little bit in depth. So you get an example. I'm going to talk about the 2 most recent matches. So on our next slide, here is Tigerstone, which is from Princeton University. And they're developing what they're calling a nimble computing interface, an NCI. And it's an endpoint platform that sits below the user OS and helps basically improve virtual desktop infrastructure. So these inventors, they've worked on this project for about 2 years, actually. So it was initially called Tiger Guard, and they were planning on making circuits that would be embedded in phones and computers. And you can imagine how hard it is to sell a chipset to other OEMs today. And they already got early advice 2 years ago that they need to pivot towards something that's more software focused, where the deployment can scale much faster, because getting buy-in on those chip systems are very hard. So they've already pivoted once. And now that they've developed this alpha, they got connected to Gene Hoffman, who's referred to us by Kirsten here at Osage University Partners, and John Partridge, who is also a connection within our own network. And they've joined the advisory board for this team and are actually leading the seed funding. So Gene Hoffman has actually helped put together a safe note system and is already reaching out to contacts of his own to help fundraise this team, as well as help guide them towards rounding out their executive team and going forward. And the team has been amazingly receptive and has been going pretty well for the past few months. So next up, as an interesting case, is Cogware. So the first team, as we said, for Tigerstone, they're in our network for about 2 years. And the match time of Gene and John being introduced to the team to a deal being done, so to say, was about 7 to 8 months, and that's the average. Cogware here is one of our fastest. So Cogware is developing a dry wireless EEG device, and they're targeting neuroanalytics for marketing, health, and other aspects. PCI Ventures has been doing a great job in building strong teams around their startups. At which point they had a few CEO interviews fall through on this team, and they're like, hey, Humdy, can you find some leads? And we sent over about 5-6 people, and they ended up getting involved here with Patrick Wood Uribe, who's previously working at Kensho Technologies, was a senior director at Advisory Board Company, had a PhD in Princeton, and is like familiar with the DC, Philadelphia, I-95 corridor. And he really clicked with them, understanding of refining their strategy, what sort of fundraising needs are needed. And over about 4 or 5 months, eventually he agreed to signing a deal. And these are a few of the examples of what Avex does of effectively kind of shepherding these connections and introductions to each other. And letting people kind of let themselves go on. I really try not to get in between these relationships, but because ultimately these are between mature consulting individuals. And with that, I'll stop for now, and we'll keep going with the presentations.
Great, thank you, Hamdi. That was very helpful, and we'll come back to a discussion about the AVX approach and other approaches as well. Mike, before we go on to you, we had a couple questions come in during Hamdi's presentation. The first applies to everybody, which is, will we be distributing the slides afterwards? And we will. We will email out the slides to all of the registrants to the webinar. And then second, there was a question that I think was specific to you, Hamdi, and I'll paraphrase it, but hopefully I get the question right. So if I don't, if the person could ask it, feel free to clarify, which is, are the teams you described, and I think in particular, I mean, the people you've connected to the venture, are they employees of the startup itself?
Yes. So it's interesting. I would say about 70% of the teams we work with are pre-license. So it's really of kind of a co-founder relationship. So it's, yes, they eventually become employees of it because they're also owners of the problem just as much as the inventors and the team that gets built around it. There have been a few cases where, for example, for Cogware, where Penn already had incorporated an LLC, and this was the hiring of a CEO who had become the employee of the startup. I hope that answered your question.
Hopefully it does as well. And I would just add on, like, our own experience with this is, like, once you have a company that is incorporated and a little bit funded in particular, they definitely become employees. The hard part is if it's before that stage. If the company has no capital and we do some of the same work around trying to find co-founders, usually anybody you connect has to be willing to spend 2 or 3 or 4 months without a paycheck working to get the company through a seed round before they become an employee. Okay, great. And then Hamdi, one last question just came in for you, and which is, could you talk about the cost to those who join AVX? Is there an annual subscription or, or any other business model there?
Certainly. So AVX started on the benefit of a major gift from the Susan and Walter Scott Foundation. Moving forward, we're going to be moving towards a annual subscription cost per university partner. And we're going to be targeting approximately $1,000 to $2,000 per year per institution. I don't hope to go too high up. The price might have to vary. We're still in the process of exploring that. We also have other expectations of finding support with various donors and sponsors and other participants in the ecosystem.
Great. Thanks. So we're going to move on then to Mike Sarathakis from University of Michigan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Sarathakis, the director of the Tech Transfer Venture Center at U of M. So our responsibility is working with projects developed and technologies developed inside the university that have a high likelihood of going down a startup path. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to review our Mentor in Residence program that is in-house at the university. We have a Mentors in Residence program, or MIR program, because we have a very high volume of startup project pipeline, as you can see from these numbers. So we actively engage very early, and we support through the actual startup and early stages of the startup, including helping them with fundraising and obviously talent, which is a major topic of this webinar. Next slide, please. So we have the good fortune of having 2 groups of mentors in residence at the University of Michigan. We have a large group, about 12 people typically, that focuses entirely on U of M technologies and startups. And then we also oversee a smaller group of 4 people that support universities across the state that don't have the same resources that the University of Michigan does, in supporting their startup and technology commercialization process. So our MIRs work typically about 50% or 20 hours a week, some less, and they are paid staff members of the University of Michigan. We have the good fortune of having support from the state for both groups, U of M covers half the salary for the U of M MIRs, and the state covers the other half, while the statewide MIRs are housed at our offices in Ann Arbor, but are entirely, their salary is entirely covered by the state, which is the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. Next slide, please. So it's all about the team, and of course we always try to use Bo's famous phrase here about the talent that we have the good fortune of having in the office. As you can see here, the venture team and specifically the mentors in residence have highly successful private careers, either in raising venture capital and starting well over 60 startups that they've been involved in. That $703 million in liquidity events, the MIRs had leadership roles in all of those events. And we have several people on the team that have also been very active in the venture capital or angel investment community in Michigan and the Midwest. Next slide, please. So our group is unusual, I think, in that our MIRs are engaged at the very earliest stage of the process here at the University of Michigan. So the entire team, both the licensing team and the venture team, are involved in reviewing invention disclosures. We get approximately 500 disclosures a year at the U, and we explore the best path forward. So we're agnostic at that stage as to whether the technology is going to go towards a traditional licensing with industry or goes down the startup path. But what we do is we bring in a lot of brain power to assess a large volume of inventions, and as a result, we provide, I think, a better service to our faculty and staff and the entire innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem across the U to provide better response times, more viable answers as to how we're going to move forward. And an added benefit to this change, which really was implemented about 2 years ago, is that it's had an incredibly positive impact on our office in bringing the venture and licensing teams closer together, which has been wasn't entirely anticipated, but we thought that would be a very beneficial thing for how our office operates. Next slide, please. So our MIRs, as you can tell, they engage early. They do many things that I think most people would be familiar with in regards to engagement and education with the teams at the U who are thinking about commercializing or interested in commercializing their inventions. You know, like what it means to actually launch a startup. We try to deliver the message that typically most of them will not be CEOs, especially if they're not willing to leave the U. We focus on how hard a process it is to launch a successful startup, including, you know, the commercialization path, selling, fundraising, making strategic partnerships, and typically things that they don't have experience in. And we have, fortunately, a lot of resources within the U. A few are listed here in regard to commercializing research at the translational research stage. We have a postdoc program through our office, again, on projects that typically have a viable commercialization path forward. We help with funding pre and post launch, and obviously we're always on the lookout for talent, especially business talent. We have great tech talent at the university, but in Michigan, across the country, we're always looking for good business leadership. Next slide, please. So the MIRs, you know, they provide a very extensive technical and business experience to each project. They're helping the teams develop realistic go-to-market and funding plans, and company formation is something we concentrate on, especially the operating agreement. We have had many examples where our startups have survived because MIRs really pound the table about you must have a operating agreement in place prior to formation. And it's something that they can give real life experience on, and the structure of the company and how the impacts of not having a solid operating agreement in place. We also help with service providers, and then again, the company team formation and growth. So not just finding the talent, but what spots need to be filled, who's sitting in the right seat if someone's going to leave the university and go to the startup, for example. Many grad students go down that path. And then we're here continuing, we're here for continued support once the company launches. Next slide, please. So our MIRs are not EIRs, entrepreneurs in residence. So we don't hire our MIRs to take leadership roles at U of M startups, but it does happen. These are entrepreneurial people. They're highly successful, as you've seen, and they do sometimes end up at our startups. This is a picture of Mike Klein, one of our past MIRs, who is now the CEO of Genomenon, what we anticipate is going to be a highly successful genome sequencing company based in Ann Arbor. And so we have to manage those invariable conflicts between the MIRs, who are active investors in the community, are actively engaged in other commercial activities outside the university, since they're only part-time employees for us. And so, we insist on extreme transparency. So even if there's a discussion about an MIR joining a team or investing in a team, they must disclose that immediately. And when they do, they're still likely going to continue on as an MIR during those discussions. And then depending on the circumstances, and we take each example on a case-by-case basis, we decide if it's time for them to leave the MIR role, or they can maintain their MIR role but not be involved as an MIR under U of M salary for that specific project. And typically the result is that the person is no longer the MIR for that project or startup, but can continue to work on other projects that are not related or competitive to that company that they're involved with. Next slide, please. So why do we do this, and why do we do it the way we do? So Michigan's a tough entrepreneurial ecosystem. We don't have as much funding as the coast, obviously. We're challenged talent-wise. The whole country's challenged talent-wise for great business talent, but in the Midwest and Michigan specifically, it's tough. We believe that the early and continued engagement gives U of M discoveries the best possible chance to have an impact outside the U and be successful. And since implementing this early engagement with discoveries in collaboration with the licensing team, we've seen our licensing and startup numbers reach record heights. But it's not just about the numbers, it's about the quality of those startups. And in fact, we've seen a dramatic increase in how our startups do once they leave our nest. Just even on one metric, investment capital, our startups have raised over, for example, last year, $690 million in venture capital. The year before that, it was about $315 million. And the numbers have grown pretty dramatically, as you can see here on the pipeline alone, just in the last 3 years. And I think that's it. Thank you.
And Mike, thank you. We just had one clarification on your terminology. When you describe a startup as being launched, so on the previous slide, you said you had 60 startups launched since 2016. How do you define launched? What stage?
So we go by, our numbers go by the autumn metric. So a startup based primarily on IP developed at the University of Michigan and has signed a license with us.
Okay. And then there are a couple of questions you mentioned kind of as part of your talk, kind of postdocs potentially kind of joining companies. And there are a couple of questions that came in on that. Like
Yep.
if a postdoc gets involved with a Michigan spinout, like who pays them? Are they focused purely on the startup, on commercialization? And then also, how often do they wind up staying with the company?
Great. So our postdoc program, I'm not a PhD, but I have the privilege of overseeing a postdoc program. is a direct result of, again, support from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. It's part of a grant that we oversee in our office that covers a postdoc program and the MIRs. The program was put in place by the state to support projects that have a high likelihood of remaining in the state and turning into a company. And we're providing the opportunity for a newly minted PhD postdoc, obviously, to work on a project where it's not clear where the path is going to go, or they're not clear on what career path they want. So we have the umbrella of working inside the university on a project that's has a higher likelihood of becoming a company, but they're still working with a faculty member as the lead. The department has to pay half, and the grant that we manage pays half, so they're remaining under the university umbrella. So if they decide to stay down the academic path, they don't have this blank about, oh, I went to a startup and I wasn't concentrating on my academics. And because we have a faculty member involved in overseeing their work, you know, it's legitimate. We're not gaming the system here. As in regard to how many go to companies, you know, we do 4 to 5 postdocs a year through that program. I would say 1 to 2 a year end up with the technology. Sometimes that technology actually gets licensed to an industry player instead of going down the startup path. Again, we don't mind that. And you know, the rest, you know, oftentimes these are still very early. They don't lead to a commercially viable launch.
Thanks. And just to build on that, you know, our own experience investing in these startups once they're a little bit further along is generally we'd like to see a postdoc or a grad student move out of the lab into that company. It's one of the best ways to get kind of the tech transfer process to really work if you have somebody who worked on in a lab. So for us, having 1 or 2 grad students or postdocs move into the startup is great, generally as long as they're not CEO. And,
yes.
and sometimes that's where it gets a little bit tricky.
Do you want me to jump on these other questions?
Yeah, why don't you just go ahead, if you see them, why don't you just go ahead and answer them?
Sure. So one question from Tim is, do we support student startups? So the University of Michigan doesn't make any claim on undergrad student startups. And so generally, no, we don't provide the same support or services in regard to that. Obviously, if a grad student's involved under the rules of U of M and that we have a claim on the IP that's developed, that could be a student startup and we would support that. But if your general question is in regard to undergraduate student startups, we do that on a voluntary basis, but it's not part of the direct mission of the office. And then there was another question from Ronnie in regard to how do you coordinate the interaction of the licensing staff and faculty with an MIR? Do licensing officers contact an MIR manager to reach an appropriate MIR? So I have 2 associate directors, Dave Repp and Chuck Cole. One's on the physical science side, one's on the life science side. And again, because of our early interaction with the licensing team in evaluating new inventions, it's a team decision. It's not this person has a lead on a project or this person, you know, whether they're on the venture side or the licensing side. So typically what happens is when we know that an MIR has talent or the experience to provide service to a new invention and the faculty member, we work with the licensing person and Dave or Chuck make a decision on the appropriate MIR, and then we reach out and engage with the faculty member, and we have an intaking process for engaging in our startup support services. But again, it's a team approach. We don't just have one MIR to one invention. We often have 2 MIRs working on 4 or 5 projects at the same time because they bring different capabilities and knowledge to the game. And again, we work very closely with the licensing team constantly. So there's usually 2 to 4 people involved in the projects that are getting traction.
Great. Mike, thanks for walking us through that and for answering the questions as well. So far we've heard about kind of two systematic approaches to finding talent. One, AVX, where you have a curated platform that helps find matches between startups and individual entrepreneurs. And at Michigan, instead, where you have a group of experienced, talented professionals that are brought to the entire kind of Michigan startup portfolio. So now we're going to move on to Hazel at Oxford Science and Innovation, which has yet another approach to finding talent for their startup. So Hazel, we'll turn it to you.
Hi, so OSI are a little bit different in that we're a commercial entity. So we sit in between Oxford Tech Transfer Office and other venture capital funds. Next slide. So we build teams alongside academics in deep science, and we work alongside the academics directly, also the Tech Transfer Office, to find novel IP. But crucially, I think our role is to also answer the so what. So you've got great IP. Will that meet a large market, either kind of new or existing? Can this be, as I said in the slide, platform defining company? Next slide. So Oxford, we've been around for a long time, longer than the US has. It's almost 1,000 years. So it's one of the oldest universities in the world. And it does well in the global stakes. So we're the #1 research university globally. There are 12,000 senior researchers here, amongst the best in the world. It's the #1 medical school in the world. It's the #1 computer science department in Europe. I've put everything in pounds, very sillily, but it's about $750 million in annualized research spend. And there's 29 science faculties, and we actually invest in across all of those science faculties. The R&D here is, it's been happening for the last 100 years. This is where penicillin came from. This is where the lithium-ion battery in all of your phones comes from. This is where the MRI machine comes from. There's an amazing wealth of scientific and technical talent here. Next slide. So we've raised quite a large fund, so it's about $1 billion. It sits on our balance sheet. As I said, we are an investor, but we work alongside the Tech Transfer Office. So we're doing pre-seed onwards, which is why we have such a large seed fund. I think sometimes people think of us as a growth fund, given that the fund is so large, but actually, we will get involved 6 months to a year pre-spin out for some of these companies. And the capital base is not just a group of passive limited partners who've given us capital. These form the basis of our network, who are helping us identify whether that novel IP can indeed match and meet a large addressable market. So it's folks like Google and Tencent, Goldman Sachs, Temasek. I've listed a bunch of them here. It's a very global list of folks who have expertise across areas of science that we look at, but also obviously the markets. And these are some of the primary folks that I go to when I'm thinking about, who's a potential chairman or who's a potential CEO for one of these companies. Next slide. So, as I said, we help to seed these companies, but as we all know, university spinouts, there is a valley of death. There's a real valley of death in the UK. We haven't had as much of a history and a legacy of creating really global companies from university IP. All of those amazing inventions that I mentioned that come out of Oxford did not result in billion-dollar companies in the UK. And so our idea is to go in really early, but we can stick around as long as it takes. So we have a unique agreement with the university, which I won't go into now, but it means that we have access to all of the academics and again are sort of talking to them before invention disclosure. And the university are very supportive of what we do, and obviously allow us to tap into any of the resources that they also have. We have a differentiated perspective on the technologies that can have a long-term commercial potential. So as I alluded to, it's all about deciding the so what. So, where will this piece of IP sit in the world? Is this genuinely going to define its category? Is this going to be the piece of technology or the piece of science that wins in its field? And that again goes to some of the shareholders that we have and this network that we've built based on those shareholders, and also an amazing list of kind of Oxford alum and people that are supportive to us. We sometimes say we're a network with a fund rather than a kind of fund with a network. And also the third thing that we would highlight is this special ability to identify and attract the right leadership team, talent, and partnerships for each opportunity. This is definitely still a work in progress. We've only been around for 4 years, and the UK definitely has suffered from what I would say is a lack of ambition. We have decided in the last 4 years to be really ruthlessly ambitious about the kinds of talent that we can attract to these companies. And rather than, maybe having folks that happen to be sort of local or to hand, we've made a commitment to get the best executive and board talent into these companies from an early stage, and use our economy of scale as a kind of international fund with this amazing international group of shareholders, to make sure that we're bringing in the best people at the stage that's right for that spin out. Next slide. So these are some of our co-investors. Again, we're trying to syndicate at seed and Series A so that there are some really great minds around the table in the boardroom when we're thinking about talent, commercial strategy, technical strategy as these companies develop. And we've even started to bring in some of these folks at point of spin out as well, so that we make sure that it's not an echo chamber. We're bringing in global minds early. Next slide. So the impact over the last 3.5 to almost 4 years, it's like $220 million capital deployed from us, but we've drawn in 5 times that in non-OSI capital. There's been more spin-outs in the last 5 years than in the past 700. I don't think they have data on the 200 years before that. I don't think there was any spin-outs from a theological college. Next slide. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach for how we think about company formation. We've been really lucky to find some founders who are actually the best person to lead their company. And so I thought I'd start with that. So Oxford Nano Imaging, it's a desktop super resolution microscope. So what usually fills a room can sit on your desk. They are selling them for any academics on here who are interested in buying one. And it's a real quantum leap in super resolution microscopy. But this is a case of, in the hands of someone who wasn't thinking ambitiously about this kind of technology, the super resolution microscope there's 1,000 of them in the world today. And you could think about this as a microscope company, but Bo Jing, who is the inventor and the founder, is the CEO, and really his vision for ONI is beyond what anyone else who didn't invent this could be. So, he sees this as somewhat akin to a kind of Apple for science. This is something that we want to see in the hands of every biologist in the world, and it has a smart back-end platform so that the scientists using this will be able to understand more about what they're seeing on that microscope. But obviously, Bo, as an academic coming out of the university, we have worked to support him first on his board. So thinking about folks that have real experience in hardware investing. His chairman, Mark Evans, is one of the most successful European venture capitalists. He's the chairman. And Torsten Ryle is the founder of Natural Motion, an Oxford spin-out that was sold for $1 billion to Zynga. They are on the board and have been helping him alongside us think about how he's going to build his management team and his commercial strategy. And so that's been a kind of top-down approach and encouraging the founder. Next slide. So Avex is a next-gen exosome platform. This is really one of only 2 companies in the world that are leading the charge in exosomes as a new drug modality. And this was yet a different approach. So rather than having the academic, who is an incredible world-class professor, he literally wrote the book on exosomes, Professor Matthew Wood, he remained in the university. And we had a fabulous COO who worked with the academics from a very early stage. He was actually a patent attorney and a scientist to put in place the preclinical operations and also develop the IP moat. So making sure that 2 years in, we were able to attract, using an executive search firm, Tony DeFusero, who is the CSO of Avex, also Moderna and Alnylam. Avex was sold to Novo Nordisk for $4 billion. And he was able to convince his ex-CEO from Avex to come on board as his chairman. So that, in that scenario, it was very much a case of how can we make sure that this company in the first 2 years has the right funding strategy and technical operations to be able to attract really world-class CEO, and then going and doing a global search for Tony and kind of expanding our network within drug modality in doing so. And obviously him bringing in Edwin was really amazing as well.
Great. Well, Hazel, thank you. And thanks to all of you for running through your program. So kind of 3 different approaches. And I'd like to kind of put out some questions to the panel, some of which come from us, some of which come from you. And maybe, and Hazel, given that you went last in presenting, I'll start with you first. Talk about when the right time to bring in outside management is, and how you think about the professor kind of as either CEO or interim manager. How early do you need to bring in outside professionals, and how do you know?
Yeah, so I think this is the big question for us. And we're asking ourselves that every day. I don't think there's a one size fits all. So we think about what is the kind of technical development of this piece of science. And if indeed this is going to be very technical milestone heavy for the first 1 to 3 years, it's going to make more sense from our perspective to have maybe an independent executive chair, someone who comes from a commercial background, and maybe putting in place a CSO or a CPO, or even a sort of more operational head of preclinical or VP of engineering, depending on what kind of science it is, to work alongside the academics. And that approach has worked really, really well for a number of our portfolio companies, because it's not such a kind of cliff edge, which is, okay, let's take this piece of IP and now create a brand new company with a whole suite of management. Day one, it's much more about what are the right milestones that will mean that we'll be able to bring in a genuinely world-class CEO, like in the case of an Avex. If the academic is going to be the CEO, then I think that, again, it's creating what's the right support structure around them. I always think it's definitely one full-time executive alongside, and again, we bring in independent board members alongside our board seat on those companies.
Yeah, no, I would just build on that from our perspective. Like, it's, in some sense, it's never too early to bring in outside talent. But as you said, it doesn't have to be a CEO. And so what you want is, in particular, as you're going through kind of product discovery, that's an area where it's generally tough for academics to do that well. And so you want to bring people in early who can help, whether they're MIRs from Michigan or an executive chairman or somebody who has commercial expertise. There was a question from one of the participants around that, which is like, how do you do that? These companies need that kind of guidance really, really early. And yet, but the companies often aren't formed, they can't pay them. And so how do you help get that team engaged and working kind of before there's even a company? And Mike, perhaps you could take that.
Yeah, we take advantage of several programs that are offered through the university or entirely housed inside the university. So we're very active in pushing companies through the I-Corps program. For people who aren't familiar with that, it's a federal program to support market and commercial discovery within universities for specific projects with direct outreach into the marketplace. And it's a very rigorous, I believe, 8 or 12-week program. And literally they're making 100 contacts into the market after assessing where to go and how to do that. There's a mentor assigned to the group. Faculty member is often involved, but most of the work is done by the grad students. We also have several translational research programs through the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. It's called MTRAC, and they're statewide for university-related projects. At the U of M, we have the transportation MTRAC and the life science MTRAC. Other universities have an ag MTRAC and a materials MTRAC, and we're about to have an new IT MTRAC, which offers about $100,000 to $150,000 per project to allow an assessment and market engagement and some later stage, development, get that first MVP out in front of customers. And those projects are reviewed by a team of internal and external people who, work in the various sectors that are related to the technology related to that MTRAC, so transportation or life sciences.
Thanks, Mike. And I would say I have a more kind of generic answer to the problem, which is to some degree kind of wishful thinking on our side, but happens sometimes, which is when you find the right outside talent, they're willing to take the risk to kind of get engaged early for free on the side. Maybe they have a day job and they're doing this on nights, or maybe they're an experienced entrepreneur and they're willing to take their time. So our best kind of really early engagements between academic founders and outside, called co-founders of various regards, is where those outsiders are so passionate about what the academic has done that they're willing to work for quite a while, basically for future equity. And they know that there's no promises, they're not getting compensated, but they're so passionate about it that they'll hang in there until the company ultimately gets funded. There was another question, Hazel, that kind of was targeted towards you, but I think maybe can go to everybody, which is like, how do you, the question is, how do you integrate your network to attract talent? So how do you structure, have you created any structured ways to use your network to go ahead and attract talent? And I might actually put the question first to Hamdi. So Hamdi, you're out trying to get more and more entrepreneurs into the Avex system. How do you do that? And outside of your universities, have you created any structured ways to do that? And then Hazel, I'd love you to answer the same question.
Well, I'll also put the question back at you, where it's such an unstructured process to some degree that I need to deal with people who are comfortable with ambiguity. So therefore, I'm afraid of structuring it too much that it incentivizes a huge pipeline of talent that actually wouldn't be the right fit for kind of discovering and working through the space. That being said, the mix of growing talent is usually by organic referral. So usually it's people who've been referred in as entrepreneurs, executives, mentors, and residences from these universities who've been put in contact with us, where their information from LinkedIn, their CV, their resume has been downloaded in, that I can sort of scout out these suggested introductions and potential matches. That sometimes, serendipitously, I'll reach out to someone and they're like, I'm not quite right for this, but I know 1 to 3 other people. And those second degree collisions have been great. Actually, the example here being that I showed earlier of Patrick Uribe. It was outreach to an earlier individual who was also working at the advisory group. It was like, hey, I'm not really looking for my next startup gig, but actually there's this new person that'd be great for you. So you should speak with Patrick. And our team spoke with him. He was in our database for about 6 months before we introduced him to PCI when Cogware went live with us. So it's kind of this organic process. I would say part of adding in talent, the important thing here is making sure when you take in, you evaluate them well, and you make sure that there's multiple points of evaluation. So I always lean on the referral source as well as myself, and I try to get a third point of information where it's usually the first introduction to a team, where I get feedback from that new institution where I'm like, hey, you just met this person. In 5 minutes or less, tell me if it's good, mediocre, or bad. And let me know if it was like kind of a conditional thing or there's something seriously wrong here that we might be missing. And it's that kind of consistent feedback loop that allows us to kind of curate our network.
Great, thanks. And I want to come back in a minute to like helping evaluate talent. But before we get to that, Hazel, like at OSI, have you done anything in a systematic way to organize and use your network to recruit talent?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we do have a CRM system where we're obviously gathering data. I'm a headhunter, so we're pretty old school by nature, which means that this is one-to-one asking folks based on a new piece of technology, whether they know folks in that space. I think what I've found is that positioning as early as possible. This is us doing due diligence. This is us working up a project rather than, we're hiring for someone from the board or we're hiring someone for the executive team. But kind of, quite frankly, playing to people's egos. Would really appreciate your view on this. Who else do you know within this space? And talking to those folks. And then ultimately, we're always then kind of selling that idea. And that has been, I mean, it sounds overly simplistic, but that has been super, super successful, where we've talked to people early, we've got them engaged, we've got, then at that point, too many advisors or too many folks that want to jump into those companies because they feel like they've got a sense of ownership. They've helped us work up that idea, help us form that commercial strategy at the early stages of the company. And they will often do that out of goodwill. The Oxford brand really helps, but obviously also we can, as OSI, pay them as consultants or give a bridge to that pre-spin-out company.
Great. And then the one thing I would add that we've done here at OUP, which is not all that groundbreaking, but if you're not doing it, you should. It's just, we have become very heavy users of LinkedIn as it comes to recruiting talent. And so like there just simply has been no better tool for us. So we will use our network through LinkedIn to help find people. We will search for former senior executives of companies that just sold. And we will do a lot of aggressive mining of LinkedIn, both to find talent and then to evaluate it. It's also a great way to help find references. And so it has made recruiting, when you're not a professional recruiter and you're doing it on the side, which we are, and I assume many of you are, much easier. So we're almost out of time here. We're scheduled to end in about 4 minutes or so. Before we do wrap up, a couple of things. Number one, there are some questions that we won't have been able to get to. We'll try to follow up with some of those offline, and so our apologies for questions that we won't have been able to answer. Second, we always need feedback on how we can improve our webinars. So you'll notice a link to your feedback survey, in your chat box. If you could please fill it out, we would really appreciate it. It'll take less than a minute, and it really helps us. And then I would like to kind of wrap up with one question to each of the three panelists, which is, we haven't spent much time talking about who do you look for in particular in like a co-founder or a founding CEO who's not an academic. And for each of you, if there are kind of one or two key characteristics that you seek out in identifying what a founding outside entrepreneur should look like, what would that be? And Hamdi, I'll start with you.
Certainly. So the important characteristics I would look for in a non-academic founder that's being recruited in, I would say it falls into a pool of three. The first one that comes to mind, even though it's the last one that can be evaluated, is usually their ability to resolve and unwind conflict. I think many of us know that for at least a lot of these inventors, they have specific styles of how they communicate, and finding that match between personalities and the way they can resolve conflicts is the hardest element. And it's one that ultimately needs to stay in the front of the mind, because especially at these earliest stages, any conflict that cannot be resolved early on and festers can get worse before any fundraising, before any further team development occurs, and it leads to a lot of waste time and hurt feelings. Beyond those two, the second one is, as Mark, Mike, Hazel has reiterated several times, is customer discovery and outreach. For a lot of scientists, they've gotten very excellent at answering questions deeply and intellectually. However, sometimes they get stuck in their bubble, and you need someone that can, I guess if I'm being hip, code switch. Someone who can switch between different environments and actually end up saying, hey, how would you need it here? And how would it work? And then third is someone who's not purely process driven, but is kind of environmentally reactive is very important. I find that there's sometimes entrepreneurs who've come from major industry positions and never really scaled a team, that they've never really gotten used to doing rapid feedback loops of testing different ways of running a group, being organized, handling tasks, that the rockiness of early stage startup creation kind of kicks them off their balance and they never really recover. Those are kind of the three elements I would say. So to re-summarize, would be conflict resolution, ability to kind of code switch or do customer discovery very well in many different environments, and then finally someone who's reactive to their environment.
Great. And Mike, what are your thoughts on it?
So I agree with Hamdi very much on the communication skills. You know, for our startups, they're launching very early. In some cases, you know, business leadership has to understand the people they're working with and the roles that the PIs play, whether they're staying at the U or being engaged with the company. And it's, you know, not just communicating how the company's moving forward, but being able to listen and understand in a proactive way and in a way that doesn't causes as little conflict as possible, I guess is the best way to put it. Engagement with a faculty member, because obviously we're here to serve our faculty members and the technology they're spinning out. Obviously, getting people with the right experience. You know, so the first CEO might not be the last CEO of a company, and that varies very much by sector. Sometimes we get CEOs who can take it from formation to exit in the software space, but in other sectors where there's more challenges and a lot more growth involved, that might not be the case. And so, you know, right person, right time. And while we don't look for people we don't require that people have success in their history in regard to companies. You know, it's great to have that. We have found it critical that people have experience in raising capital for their startups if the startup is going to require that. And many of our mentors have raised money for startups that haven't succeeded. But that experience and what they learned from that was really important. And they were successful the next time around.
Great, thank you. Hazel.
So definitely agree with everything that Mike and Hamdi have said. For me, there's two sort of non-negotiables in a CEO or co-founder. The first is definitely vision. I think someone who can sell the vision of the science to hires, to partners or customers, to investors. I think that is the sort of piece of ambition, thinking about these technologies in a very big way. And the second is something that I think really has hit home over the last 18 months, which is a sense of responsibility. So who is going to be the backstop for this company? They're going to tie everything together. They're going to make sure that they can't just be an individual contributor. They make sure that they tie together the R&D with the productionizing, with the commercial, with the investor strategy, and ultimately take responsibility for all of that sort of working in harmony together.
Great, thank you. And as you can see from both the overlap and the differences in the three answers from Hamdi, Mike, and Hazel, there is no one right answer to this question. So at OUP, we've tried to kind of identify what are really the key critical success factors for a CEO. How do you know them and spot them in advance? And what we can confidently say is that there's no right answer to the question, that in different situations, different skills are required, and there's no formula. If we could have found a formula for picking talent, we would have done so. So with that, I want to thank everybody. So Hamdi, Hazel, and Mike, I want to thank all three of you for being our panelists today, and I want to thank all of our participants for joining us. If you have any additional questions for our speakers, either the ones we did not answer or other ones, you could see on the screen here the email addresses for the speakers. And we want to thank everyone again, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.